Montana Territory, 1875. The autumn wind swept across the rolling grasslands, carrying the promise of an early winter. Quincy Zane tightened his grip on the reins as his horse picked its way along the narrow trail that wound through Blackfoot Valley. At 25, Quincy had already seen enough of the frontier's cruelty to last several lifetimes. The fresh scar across his left forearm, courtesy of an angry gambler in Helena last spring, was but the newest addition to his collection. The weight of his Colt revolver against his hip offered more comfort than the Bible his mother had pressed into his hands before he'd left Missouri 3 years prior. Out here, a man survived by his wits and his weapon, not by prayer. He'd learned that lesson the hard way when his first cattle drive had been set upon by rustlers who'd shown no mercy to his companions. "The West doesn't care about dreams or friendship," he muttered to his bay gelding. "It only respects strength and solitude." The horse nickered in response, perhaps the only creature Quincy still allowed himself to speak honestly with. His lean face, bronzed by years under the Montana sun, rarely broke into genuine smiles anymore. When it did, the expression never quite reached his deep-set hazel eyes. At 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and narrow hips, he cut an impressive figure, handsome enough to catch women's glances in town, but the thin layer of stubble on his square jaw and the hard set of his mouth usually discouraged their approach. That suited him fine. Getting close to people out here was asking for heartbreak by bullet, disease, or betrayal. Quincy had carved out a small existence for himself. Seasonal work with cattle outfits, hunting and trapping in between, and occasionally breaking horses for ranchers who appreciated his firm but patient hand with spirited mounts. It wasn't much, but it was his, and it demanded nothing of his heart. As Quincy crested the hill overlooking Cottonwood Creek, he spotted a wagon tilted precariously near the ford. A figure in a pale blue dress moved frantically around it, clearly in distress. His first instinct was to turn around. Other people's troubles had a way of becoming his own out here, but something made him hesitate. Perhaps it was the memory of his mother's voice. "Your father may have made you strong, Quincy, but I raised you to be good." With a resigned sigh, he nudged his horse forward, keeping one hand near his pistol as he approached. "Never know what kind of trap might be waiting," he reminded himself. "Hello, the wagon," he called when he was within earshot. "Need some assistance." The woman spun around, her hand flying to her throat. She couldn't have been more than 20, with honey-blonde hair escaping a once neat bun. Her dress, though dusty from travel, was finely made, out of place in this harsh country. What struck Quincy most, however, was the mixture of relief and wariness that crossed her delicate features. "Oh, thank heaven," she exclaimed, then immediately seemed to regret her enthusiasm. "I mean, yes, sir, if you wouldn't mind. The wheel's broken and my brother's gone ahead to the settlement for supplies. He should have returned yesterday." Quincy dismounted cautiously, scanning the area for signs of trouble. "You've been here alone overnight?" The question came out harsher than he'd intended. She lifted her chin slightly. "I can handle myself, Mr. Zane, Quincy Zane." "Miss Sophia Grantham," she replied with a small curtsy that seemed absurdly formal under the circumstances. "And yes, I've been alone, but I'm well armed." She gestured toward the wagon, where Quincy spotted the gleam of a shotgun resting against the seat. Something about her struck him as odd. Her speech carried hints of Eastern refinement, yet she had the practical awareness of frontier dangers. Her blue eyes held none of the naive innocence he'd expect from a recent arrival. Instead, they carried a haunted vigilance that reminded him too much of his own reflection. "Where are you headed, Miss Grantham?" Quincy asked as he examined the wagon's damaged wheel. "White Rock," she replied. "My brother and I are opening a mercantile there." Quincy frowned. White Rock's still 3 days' journey, and this axle's cracked beyond repair. He glanced up at the darkening sky. Storms coming too, not the gentle kind. Sophia's composure slipped for just a moment, revealing genuine fear before she masked it with determination. "Then I suppose I'll need to fashion a shelter for the night and hope Richard returns with help by morning." Quincy straightened up, dusting his hands on his worn denim trousers. The smart thing would be to give her some advice, maybe leave her his spare blanket and be on his way. Getting involved with travelers, especially ones as suspiciously well-dressed and vague as Miss Grantham, was asking for trouble. "There's a line shack about 2 miles north," he found himself saying instead. "Belongs to the Broken Arrow Ranch where I sometimes work. It's stocked with basic provisions, and you'd be safer there than out in the open." "And my possessions?" "Our merchandise?" she asked, gesturing to the loaded wagon. We can cover it with your tarp, take what valuables you can't stand to lose. I'll help your brother salvage the rest when he returns." The offer surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her. Sophia studied him carefully, weighing her limited options. After a moment she nodded. "I'd be grateful for your help, Mr. Zane." As they gathered her essential belongings, Quincy noticed several things that didn't fit the mercantile story. A small wooden box she handled with particular care, a man's pocket watch she quickly tucked away when she caught him looking, and the fact that most of their merchandise consisted of household items rather than trading goods. She was lying about something, but then, who wasn't out here? Everyone who came to the Montana territory was running either toward something or away from something, often both. Whatever Miss Grantham's secrets were, they were hers to keep, so long as they didn't endanger him. The first fat raindrops began to fall as Quincy helped Sophia mount behind him on his horse. He felt her hesitate before placing her hands lightly on his sides. "You'll fall off that way," he said bluntly. "Hold on properly or walk." After a moment's pause, her arms slipped around his waist. As they rode toward the lined shack, Quincy tried to ignore the unfamiliar warmth of another person pressed against his back. It had been a long time since he'd been this close to anyone. The sensation was unwelcome, a reminder of human contact he'd trained himself not to miss. The rain was coming down in earnest by the time they reached the simple one-room cabin. Quincy quickly stabled his horse in the lean-to at the back while Sophia waited under the small porch overhang. "It's not much," he said as he unlocked the door, "but it's solid and dry." The cabin was spare but clean, a testament to the Broken Arrow's standards. A small iron stove stood in one corner, a narrow cot against the far wall, a rough-hewn table with two chairs in the center, and open shelves stocked with basic provisions along one side. "I can sleep in the lean-to with my horse," Quincy offered, already feeling uncomfortable with the close quarters. "Don't be ridiculous," Sophia replied as she removed her damp shawl. "The floor near the stove will be perfectly adequate for one of us, and we can take turns on the cot." Quincy raised an eyebrow at her practicality. Most proper Eastern ladies would have fainted at the suggestion of sharing a cabin with a strange man. Miss Grantham, it seemed, had priorities better suited to survival. As he built a fire in the stove, Quincy observed her from the corner of his eye. She moved with a certain precision, taking inventory of their surroundings, checking the window latches, keeping the shotgun within reach. These were not the habits of a shopkeeper's sister. "Your brother," Quincy said casually as he put coffee on to boil, "he experienced with frontier travel." Sophia paused in unpacking a small bundle of her belongings. "Richard served in the war. He knows how to handle himself." "Which side?" Her eyes flashed. "The right one, Mr. Zane. Does it matter out here?" "Suppose not," Quincy conceded. "War's been over 10 years now. Most men just trying to live with what they did, whichever uniform they wore." Something in her expression softened slightly. "And you, Mr. Zane, did you fight?" "Too young," he replied, "but my father and older brother did, Union." Only my father came back. He hadn't meant to share that, but something about her directness pulled the truth from him. The cabin fell silent except for the drumming of rain on the roof and the crackle of the stove fire. Sophia turned back to her belongings, and Quincy busied himself preparing a simple meal from the cabin's stores. The domesticity of the scene felt foreign to him, like wearing someone else's ill-fitting clothes. As they ate beans and hardtack by lantern light, Quincy found himself studying the woman across from him. In the warm glow, her features softened from their earlier vigilance. She was beautiful in a quiet way that crept up on you, not the bold, painted beauty of saloon girls, but something more enduring. There was a story written in the tiny worry line between her brows, in the way her eyes constantly checked the window at every sound. "Your brother," Quincy said finally, "he wouldn't have gone to White Rock, would he? It's the wrong direction from here." "Carson City's much closer for supplies." Sophia's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. She set it down carefully, her composure never slipping. "You know this area well. Well enough to know when someone's lying about where they're headed." For a long moment she said nothing, measuring him with those perceptive blue eyes. "Then we're not opening a mercantile." "Figured as much." "Are you going to ask what we are doing?" Quincy shrugged. "Not my business unless it becomes my problem." A bitter smile touched her lips. "A practical philosophy, Mr. Zane. Out here, practical keeps you alive." "Yes," she agreed softly, "I'm beginning to understand that." After dinner, the close quarters became more apparent as they prepared for sleep. Quincy insisted Sophia take the cot for the first half of the night while he made do with blankets near the stove. As she arranged her bedding, a small leather-bound book fell from her pocket. Quincy picked it up before she could reach it. It wasn't his intention to pry, but as he handed it back, he couldn't help noticing the embossed name on the cover, Samuel Grantham. "My father's," she explained quickly, taking it and tucking it securely beneath her pillow. "Thought your name was Richard." "My brother's name is Richard," she corrected. "Richard Grantham, my father was Samuel." "Was." Sophia's face closed like a shuttered window. "He died 3 months ago in Denver." "Murdered?" The blunt admission hung in the air between them. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley. "I'm sorry," Quincy offered inadequately. She turned away. "So am I, Mr. Zane, more than you can imagine." As Quincy settled onto his makeshift bed, he found himself more intrigued by Sophia Grantham than he wanted to be. There was a story there, one involving death and likely pursuit, given her constant vigilance. The smart thing would be to part ways at first light, point her toward Carson City, and continue on alone as he'd always done. Yet as sleep claimed him, his last thought was of the sorrow in her eyes when she spoke of her father, a sorrow that mirrored what he'd felt when his own father had been lowered into the ground all those years ago. Dawn broke with clearing skies and a stillness that suggested the storm had passed. Quincy woke instantly, a habit formed from years of sleeping in the open. His hand reflexively moved to the revolver beside him before he remembered where he was. The lined shack, the broken wagon, Miss Grantham. He sat up to find the cot empty, the blanket neatly folded. Panic gripped him briefly until the door opened and Sophia stepped inside, her hair damp and her face freshly washed. She carried a pail of water from the nearby stream. "Good morning," she said, seeming surprised to find him awake. "I thought I'd prepare breakfast before we decided what to do next." Quincy nodded, uncomfortable with the domesticity, but appreciating the practical approach. "We should check your wagon, see if anything's been disturbed overnight." As they shared a breakfast of coffee and Johnny cakes, Sophia seemed to come to some decision. She set down her tin cup with deliberation. "Mr. Zane, I haven't been entirely truthful with you. I noticed. My brother and I aren't headed to White Rock. We're traveling to Helena, where my father had business associates. We're being followed by the men who killed him, and Richard went ahead to arrange safer transport. What did your father have that they want badly enough to chase you across territories?" Sophia hesitated. "Evidence of corruption involving several prominent Denver businessmen and territorial officials. My father was a journalist." Pieces fell into place. The careful way she handled that wooden box, the vigilance, the inconsistencies in her story. "Your brother's not coming back, is he?" Quincy asked quietly. Pain flashed across her face. "I don't know, he should have returned by now. He may have been intercepted. Or he cut and ran, leaving you with the evidence and the danger." The words were harsh, but Quincy had seen enough of human nature not to discount the possibility. "Richard wouldn't abandon me," Sophia said with such conviction that Quincy almost believed her. "But if he's been delayed or, worse, I can't stay here waiting. I need to reach Helena." Quincy stood and paced the small cabin. This was exactly the kind of entanglement he avoided, someone else's fight, someone else's enemies. He'd worked hard to build a life where he answered to no one and protected only himself. "Helena's 4 days' ride in good weather," he said finally, "assuming these men don't catch up to you first." "I have money," she offered. "I can pay you to guide me." "It's not about money." Quincy ran a hand through his dark hair in frustration. "It's about stepping into someone else's war. That's a good way to end up dead out here." Sophia rose and faced him squarely. "I understand if you want no part of this, Mr. Zane. You've already shown me more kindness than most would. I can make my own way to Carson City and find transport there." The image of this determined young woman attempting to traverse the dangerous territory alone, with killers on her trail, made something twist uncomfortably in Quincy's chest. It wasn't his problem, it wasn't his fight, and yet, "We'll need supplies," he found himself saying, "and we'll have to avoid the main trails if someone's looking for you." Surprise and relief washed over her face. "You'll help me reach Helena." "I'll get you there," Quincy agreed, already questioning his sanity. "But I set the route and the pace, and you tell me everything about who might be following us. No more half-truths." Agreed, she extended her hand to seal the bargain. When Quincy took it, he felt a tremor run through her fingers. Not the nervous flutter of a proper lady uncomfortable with touch, this was different, deeper. a trembling born of exhaustion, fear, and the relief of finding an ally when she most needed one. She trembled when the cowboy touched her hand, and he knew it was not from shyness. It was from the weight she'd been carrying alone, a weight he had just agreed to share. The realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit. They spent the morning retrieving essential items from the wagon. Sophia insisted on bringing the wooden box, which she finally opened for Quincy to see. Inside lay a leather portfolio containing newspaper clippings, letters, and what appeared to be financial records, all neatly organized and annotated in a precise hand. My father spent 2 years building this case, Sophia explained as she carefully rewrapped the portfolio. It implicates Judge Warren Hollister and several mining executives in a scheme that's stolen thousands of acres from legitimate homesteaders. Hollister, Quincy whistled low. He's got connections all through the territory, and a reputation for not leaving witnesses. Yes, Sophia said quietly, we discovered that too late. By midday, they were ready to depart. Quincy had mapped a route that would keep them away from settlements while still allowing access to water and shelter. It would add an extra day to their journey, but significantly reduce their chances of being spotted. As they rode out, Sophia now on a mare from the line shack that Quincy promised to return, he found himself studying her profile against the vast Montana sky. At 20 years old, she should have been attending socials and entertaining suitors, not fleeing across dangerous territory with evidence of corruption clutched to her chest. Yet she sat straight in the saddle, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon, absorbing every instruction he gave about frontier travel. You ride well, he observed as they forded a shallow creek. My father believed women should be as capable as men, she replied. It scandalized my mother's family in Boston, but I'm grateful for it now. Your mother died when I was 12. Influenza, the matter-of-fact way she stated it spoke volumes about how early she had learned that life offered no guarantees. They made good progress that afternoon, covering rough country that would discourage casual pursuit. Quincy chose a sheltered hollow for their night camp, with clear sightlines in all directions and multiple escape routes. As they sat beside a small, carefully banked fire, Sophia asked, "What brought you to Montana, mister?" Zane. Quincy poked at the embers with a stick. Same as most, I suppose, opportunity, space, a chance to leave the past behind. What past were you leaving? He shot her a sharp glance. Does it matter? I've trusted you with my life and my secrets, she said simply. I'd like to know something of the man I'm depending on. Fair enough, Quincy sighed and leaned back against his saddle. Missouri became too crowded after the war. Too many bitter memories, too many people who couldn't let old hatreds die. My father never recovered from his wounds, not really. He lasted 5 years before his heart gave out. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago, Quincy stared into the flames. I tried farming the family land for a while, but without him and my brother, it just felt empty. So I sold it and headed west, worked cattle drives, broke horses, did some scouting for the army. Kept moving. Always alone. The question struck closer to the bone than he liked. Alone is simpler, no one to disappoint, no one to lose. Sophia studied him in the firelight. That sounds more like existing than living, Mr. Zane. Out here, existing is achievement enough. His tone made it clear the conversation was over. They ate their supper in silence after that, each lost in private thoughts. When it came time to sleep, they arranged their bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, but close enough to alert each other in case of trouble. Despite his exhaustion, Quincy found sleep elusive. He was acutely aware of Sophia's presence just a few feet away, of the responsibility he'd taken on. For years, he'd survived by committing to nothing and no one. Now he'd pledged to deliver this woman and her dangerous evidence safely to Helena, possibly against formidable enemies. What troubled him most was how natural the decision had felt in the moment, as if some long-dormant part of himself had awakened and overruled his careful detachment. Dawn of their second day on the trail brought a heavy mist that clung to the rolling hills, limiting visibility but also providing cover. They broke camp quickly, speaking little as they fell into an efficient rhythm together. By mid-morning, the fog had burned away to reveal a vast landscape of autumn golden grasslands stretching toward distant mountains. It's beautiful, Sophia said softly as they paused on a ridgeline. Even knowing its dangers, I can see why men risk everything to claim a piece of this land. Quincy followed her gaze across the wild country. Beauty's the most dangerous thing about it. Makes you forget how quickly it can kill you. Is that why you've never settled? She asked, never claimed land of your own. What makes you think I haven't? Sophia gave him a knowing look. A man with roots doesn't take up with a stranger's troubles so easily. He has too much to lose. Before Quincy could respond, his attention snapped to the horizon. A thin column of dust rose from the prairie several miles to the south, riders moving fast along the main trail they'd been avoiding. "Get down," he ordered, pulling Sophia from her saddle into the cover of some rocks. They watched as three riders came into view, their course intersecting with the path Quincy and Sophia would have taken had they not diverted cross-country. "Can you tell who they are?" Sophia whispered, her body tense beside him. Quincy squinted against the sun. "Not at this distance, but they're pushing hard and looking for something. Or someone." They remained hidden until the riders disappeared from view, heading toward Carson City. Only when Quincy was certain the men were gone did he allow them to continue, but he altered their route further north as a precaution. "Do you think it was them?" Sophia asked as they rode. "The men who killed my father. Can't be sure, but we should assume they're searching for you." Quincy adjusted his hat against the noon sun. "Tell me more about them. How many? What do they look like?" Sophia's hands tightened on her reins. "There were three the night they came for my father. One was tall and thin with a scar across his cheek. They called him Reeves. Another was heavyset with a red beard. I didn't see the third clearly. He stayed in the shadows." "Reeves," Quincy repeated thoughtfully. "There's a Reeves who rides with Judge Hollister's Cattle Association. Enforcer type, mean reputation." "That would make sense," Sophia said grimly. Her voice faltered. "After they shot my father, Reeves said to search for his papers. Richard and I had hidden them in the root cellar. We escaped out the back while they were tearing the house apart." "And you've been running ever since?" 3 months, she confirmed. "We've stayed ahead of them mostly because they didn't know exactly where we were headed, but if they've tracked us to this territory." "They're closing in," Quincy finished for her. His jaw tightened. "We'll push harder, reach Helena before they realize we've changed course." They rode until dusk, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and eat cold rations. Quincy found himself increasingly impressed by Sophia's endurance and lack of complaint despite the grueling pace. Most women of her background would have faltered hours ago, but she matched him mile for mile, her determination never wavering. As night fell, they were forced to make camp in less than ideal circumstances, a small grove of cottonwoods with limited visibility. Quincy decided against a fire despite the autumn chill. "It'll be cold tonight," he warned as he unsaddled their horses. "I've endured worse these past months," Sophia replied, unpacking their bedrolls. When Quincy turned to help her, he found her struggling with the buckles on her saddle, her fingers stiff with cold and fatigue. Without thinking, he stepped closer and covered her hands with his own. "Let me," he said quietly. Their eyes met in the gathering darkness and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of shared purpose that transcended their brief acquaintance. Her hands trembled beneath his, not from fear this time, but from something neither of them was prepared to name. Quincy quickly finished the task and stepped back, suddenly uncomfortable with their proximity. "We should get some rest. Dawn comes early, and we need to cover a lot of ground tomorrow." Sophia nodded, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders against the night air. "Thank you, Mr. Zane, not just for this but for everything." "I know this isn't your fight." "Get some sleep, Miss Grantham," he replied gruffly, retreating to his own bedroll. But sleep proved elusive for Quincy as he lay staring at the stars visible through the cottonwood branches. Despite his best efforts to maintain emotional distance, he found himself increasingly invested in Sophia's welfare and her mission. Her courage in pursuing justice for her father, her resilience in the face of danger, these qualities had begun to erode the careful walls he'd built around himself since leaving Missouri. It was dangerous, this softening. Caring made you vulnerable, and vulnerability got you killed out here. Yet as he listened to Sophia's steady breathing a few feet away, he couldn't summon the detachment that had served him so well for years. Morning arrived with a bitter wind from the north, carrying the scent of snow. They broke camp quickly, both aware that the weather could become another enemy if they didn't reach shelter before a storm hit. "There's an old trapper's cabin about 15 miles ahead," Quincy explained as they mounted up. "If we push hard, we can reach it by midday." The terrain grew steadily more challenging as they entered the foothills. Twice they had to dismount and lead the horses up steep inclines. Quincy noticed Sophia wincing occasionally, though she never complained. "Your arm's bothering you," he observed during a brief rest. She looked surprised that he'd noticed. It's nothing, just a scratch from when we fled Denver. Let me see it. After a moment's hesitation, she rolled up her sleeve to reveal a poorly healed gash along her forearm, clearly more than a scratch. The wound had closed but looked red and angry at the edges. This needs proper cleaning, Quincy said, frowning. Why didn't you mention it before? It seemed unimportant compared to everything else. Infection isn't unimportant. It can kill you just as dead as a bullet. He reached into his saddlebag for a small tin of salve. This will help until we can clean it properly at the cabin. As he applied the medicine to her arm, his touch was gentler than his words. Sophia watched his face, the concentration in his hazel eyes, the firm set of his jaw, and felt something shift inside her. In this harsh land where trust was a luxury few could afford, Quincy Zane had become her anchor. There, he said, rolling her sleeve back down, try not to use that arm more than necessary. Thank you, she replied softly. Their eyes held for a moment too long before Quincy cleared his throat and turned away. We should keep moving, those clouds don't look friendly. They reached the trapper's cabin just as the first snowflakes began to fall. It was smaller and more primitive than the lined shack, but it offered solid walls against the weather and a stone fireplace that would provide much-needed warmth. While Quincy saw to the horses in the lean-to, Sophia took inventory of their shelter. A single room with a plank bed frame, a rough table, one chair, and various shelves holding traps and tools. Not comfortable by any measure, but after months on the run, it seemed like luxury to her. By the time Quincy returned, stamping snow from his boots, Sophia had swept the floor and was attempting to start a fire with the limited dry kindling available. Here, he said, kneeling beside her and taking over the task. There's a trick to it when the wood's damp. Under his skilled hands, a small flame soon caught and grew. They worked together to prepare a hot meal, their first since leaving the lined shack, and the simple act of sharing warmth and food created an intimacy neither had expected. Tell me about your home in Missouri, Sophia said as they ate. What was it like before the war changed everything? Quincy rarely spoke of his past, but something about the isolation, the storm outside, and Sophia's genuine interest loosened his usual reserve. It was good land, fertile bottom soil near the river, rolling hills for grazing. My father built the house himself when he married my mother, added rooms as the family grew. A faint smile touched his lips. We had orchards, apple and pear. My mother made the best preserves in the county. You miss it, Sophia observed. I miss what it was, Quincy corrected, not what it became after the war, too many ghosts. And out here, have you found what you were looking for? Quincy considered the question. Found freedom, I suppose, space to breathe, but not roots. Not yet. Perhaps you weren't ready for them. Their conversation continued as the storm intensified outside, howling around the cabin's eaves. They shared stories from their lives, Sophia of her childhood in Denver, where her father's newspaper had given voice to the voiceless. Quincy of his years drifting through the territories, working cattle and breaking horses. As night fell and the cabin grew dark except for the firelight, something changed in the atmosphere between them. The danger waiting outside, the uncertain future, the shared confidences, all combined to create a connection neither had anticipated. We should rest, Quincy said finally, aware they were venturing into territory as dangerous in its way as the snow-covered mountains. The storm might pass by morning, and we need to make Helena by tomorrow night. Sophia nodded but made no move to prepare for sleep. Instead, she said, Why did you really agree to help me, Mr. Zane? You could have pointed me toward Carson City and continued on your way. The question hung between them, demanding honesty. I don't know, Quincy admitted after a long pause. It wasn't smart, it wasn't safe. But leaving you alone seemed, he struggled to find the words. It seemed like the kind of choice that stays with a man, the kind he can't take back. And you've made too many of those already, Sophia said quietly. Maybe, Quincy stared into the fire, or maybe I'm tired of only looking out for myself, tired of pretending the rest of the world doesn't matter. Sophia moved to sit beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. My father used to say that neutrality in the face of injustice is just cowardice by another name. Your father sounds like he was a brave man. He was, her voice wavered, and I'm terrified I won't be brave enough to finish what he started, that those men will succeed in burying the truth with him. You rode across 2 territories with killers on your trail, Quincy said, turning to face her. I'd say that qualifies as brave. In the firelight, with snow falling outside and danger perhaps only hours behind them, they found themselves at a crossroads neither had anticipated. Sophia's eyes held questions Quincy had spent years avoiding, and his own heart betrayed him with answers he wasn't ready to acknowledge. "We should get some sleep," he said again, more firmly this time. "I'll take first watch." Sophia nodded, accepting his retreat. As she settled onto the plank bed with their blankets, Quincy positioned himself by the window, rifle across his lap. The storm had transformed the world outside into a swirling white void, both concealing them and trapping them in place. He glanced at Sophia, now sleeping, her face softened in repose. Something protective and fierce stirred in his chest, something he'd thought long buried beneath years of solitude and survival. Dangerous indeed. Morning brought clear skies and a world transformed by snow, beautiful, treacherous, and silent. They set out at first light, knowing the storm would have temporarily halted their pursuers, but also aware that the fresh snow would make their own tracks easy to follow. "We'll stay in the trees as much as possible," Quincy explained as they saddled the horses. "The snow's not as deep there and we'll leave less of a trail." They rode hard throughout the day, stopping only briefly to rest the horses. The snow made travel slower but not impossible, and by late afternoon they could see the smoke from Helena's chimneys rising in the distance. "We made it," Sophia breathed, relief evident in her voice. "Not yet," Quincy cautioned. "Getting into town unnoticed is our next challenge. These men will have contacts watching for you." As they approached the outskirts of Helena, Quincy led them on a circuitous route that avoided the main roads. The sun was setting by the time they reached a modest boarding house on a quiet side street. "The widow who runs this place is discreet," Quincy explained as they dismounted in the alley behind the building. "She doesn't ask questions." The widow, a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Fletcher, took one look at Sophia's exhausted state and Quincy's protective stance and nodded briskly. "Room at the back, ground floor, has its own entrance, $2 a night, meals included." "We need to send a message," Quincy added, placing extra coins on the counter. "To James Harrington at the Territorial Marshal's office. Can you arrange that without drawing attention?" Mrs. Fletcher pocketed the money with a nod. "My grandson can deliver it. No one notices a boy running errands." Once settled in the small but clean room, Sophia sank onto the edge of the bed, the wooden box containing her father's evidence clutched to her chest. The journey's toll was evident in the shadows beneath her eyes and the slight tremor in her hands. "We'll rest here tonight," Quincy said, checking the room's locks and sightlines out of habit. "Tomorrow we'll contact this associate of your father's and turn over the evidence." "And then?" Sophia asked quietly. The question hung between them, laden with implications neither was prepared to address. Quincy had fulfilled his promise to deliver her safely to Helena. Their paths, which had crossed so unexpectedly, should now diverge again, him back to his solitary existence, her to whatever future awaited after justice was served. "First things first," he replied, avoiding her eyes. "Let's get through tonight." Mrs. Fletcher brought them a hot meal, which they ate in grateful silence. Afterward, Quincy insisted on cleaning Sophia's injured arm properly. The wound looked better than he'd feared, responding well to the salve he'd applied. "You'll have a scar," he said as he wrapped a clean bandage around her forearm, "but it should heal clean now." "Another reminder," Sophia murmured. "As if I needed one." Quincy's fingers lingered on her wrist, feeling her pulse beneath his thumb. "Not all reminders are of loss, Miss Grantham. Some can be of survival. Of strength." Their eyes met, and the connection that had been building between them throughout their journey intensified in the lamplight. Sophia's hand turned in his grasp until their palms pressed together, fingers intertwining. "Sophia," she corrected softly. "After everything, I think you should call me Sophia." Before Quincy could respond, a sharp knock at the door startled them apart. He motioned for Sophia to stay back as he drew his revolver and approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" he called. "Message from Marshal Harrington," came a boy's voice. Quincy opened the door a crack to find Mrs. Fletcher's grandson holding a folded note. He took it with a nod of thanks and closed the door, breaking the seal with his thumb. The message was brief but clear. "Come at dawn, bring everything, trust no one else." "He'll meet us tomorrow," Quincy said, passing the note to Sophia. "Until then, we stay alert." The night stretched long before them. They took turns sleeping, one always on watch by the window, but even in rest, tension kept them both on edge. Every sound from the street drew their attention. Every shadow seemed to hold potential threat. During his watch, Quincy found his gaze repeatedly drawn to Sophia as she slept. In the few days since their paths had crossed, she had upended his carefully constructed worldview. Her courage, her determination to see justice done despite the danger, these qualities challenged his belief that the frontier was no place for ideals or connections. As dawn approached, Sophia woke and joined him at the window. The streets of Helena were beginning to stir with early morning activity. "It's almost over," she said quietly. "After today, my father's killers will face justice and his work will be completed." "What will you do then?" Quincy asked, the question that had haunted him through the night finally finding voice. Sophia gazed out at the awakening town. "I don't know, Denver holds too many painful memories now. Perhaps I'll go east to my mother's family, or," she hesitated, glancing at him, "or find somewhere new to begin again." The unspoken question hung between them, but before Quincy could respond, movement in the street caught his attention. Three riders moved slowly down the main thoroughfare, one tall and lean, another heavily built with a rust-colored beard, the third keeping to the shadows between buildings. "They're here," he whispered, pulling Sophia away from the window. "Reeves and his men." Fear flashed across her face, quickly replaced by determination. "Then we need to move now before they find us." They gathered their few belongings swiftly, Sophia clutching the wooden box that had cost her father his life. Mrs. Fletcher met them in the hallway, her expression grave. "Two men asking questions at the front desk," she whispered, "looking for a young woman traveling with a cowboy." "Is there another way out?" Quincy asked. "Through the kitchen." "My grandson will show you." She pressed a small revolver into Sophia's hand. "Take this. Helena's no place for an unarmed woman." They followed the boy through the boarding house's kitchen and out a back door that opened onto a narrow alley. The marshal's office was 3 blocks away, 3 blocks of exposure in a town where enemies were already searching. "Stay close," Quincy instructed, drawing his own revolver. "If anything happens, run for the marshal's office. Don't look back, don't wait for me." Sophia's hand closed around his forearm. "We go together or not at all." The fierce certainty in her voice brooked no argument. Quincy nodded, a new respect dawning in his eyes. They moved through the alley and onto a side street, keeping to shadows and doorways, working their way toward the territorial building that housed the marshal's office. They were 1 block away when a shout rang out behind them. Quincy turned to see the red-bearded man pointing in their direction, Reeves emerging from a saloon doorway at his call. "Run," Quincy urged, pushing Sophia ahead of him. They sprinted down the street, the sounds of pursuit close behind. As they reached the steps of the territorial building, a shot cracked the morning air. Quincy felt the bullet whiz past his ear, splintering wood on the doorframe beside him. He spun and returned fire, forcing their pursuers to dive for cover. It bought them enough time to burst through the doors into the building's main hallway. "Marshal's office," Sophia gasped, pointing toward a door marked with the territorial seal. They were halfway there when the third man, the one who had kept to the shadows, stepped out from a side corridor, blocking their path. In his hand gleamed a Bowie knife, its blade catching the morning light streaming through the windows. "Hello, Miss Grantham," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "You've led us quite a chase." Quincy raised his revolver, but the man clicked his tongue. "I wouldn't. My associates are right behind you, and this hallway would make a fine shooting gallery." As if on cue, the front doors burst open, and Reeves entered with his red-bearded companion, both with guns drawn. "The evidence, if you please," the knife-wielder continued, extending his free hand toward Sophia. "Judge Hollister is most anxious to recover his property." "It isn't his," Sophia replied, her voice steady despite the danger. "These are my father's papers proving Hollister's corruption. They belong to justice, not to him." "A noble sentiment," the man sneered, "but this is the frontier, my dear. Justice belongs to whoever has the most guns or the most money. Today that's not you." Quincy assessed their situation with growing desperation. They were outnumbered and outflanked, with no clear path to escape. His mind raced through options, each more desperate than the last. Before he could act, the door to the marshal's office swung open. A tall man with iron-gray hair and a silver star on his chest stepped into the hallway, shotgun leveled at Reeves and his companion. "I believe the lady said no," Marshal Harrington stated calmly. "Now everyone's going to lower their weapons, or this building's going to need a fresh coat of paint on the walls." The knife-wielder hesitated, calculating his odds. With the marshal covering his companions, he found himself in a standoff with Quincy, whose revolver remained trained on his chest. "You're making a mistake, Marshal," he said. "Judge Hollister won't forget this interference." "Judge Hollister isn't the only authority in this territory," Harrington replied. And I've got telegraph wires to the governor and federal marshals that work just fine. Now drop the knife." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then, with deliberate slowness, the man lowered his weapon. "Wise choice," Harrington nodded. "Miss Grantham, Mr. Zane, please join me in my office. The rest of you gentlemen can wait in the cells until we sort this out." As deputies emerged to take custody of the three men, Sophia sagged against Quincy in relief. He instinctively wrapped an arm around her shoulders, supporting her as they followed the marshal into the safety of his office. Inside, Harrington secured the door and turned to face them, his expression grave but kind. "Samuel Grantham was a good friend and a better man. When his letter reached me warning of what he'd uncovered, I tried to arrange protection. I was too late." "You knew my father?" Sophia asked. "We served together in the war, different units, same causes." The marshal gestured toward chairs. "Please sit, you look exhausted, both of you." As they settled into the offered seats, Sophia placed the wooden box on Harrington's desk. "Everything's here, all the evidence my father collected against Hollister and his mining consortium. Account ledgers, witness statements, land deeds with forged signatures." Harrington opened the box with reverent care. "This is enough to bring down half the corrupt officials in Colorado Territory, maybe beyond. Samuel didn't die for nothing, Miss Grantham, I promise you that." "What happens now?" Quincy asked, still on edge despite the immediate danger having passed. "Now I telegraph the territorial governor and the federal marshal's office in Denver. These papers go into the vault until federal agents arrive to take custody." Harrington's gaze softened as he looked at Sophia. "And you, young lady, stay under my protection until this is resolved. Those men outside were just Hollister's hired muscle. He has deeper connections." "My brother," Sophia began hesitantly. "Richard. He went for help days ago and never returned." Harrington's face grew somber. "I'm sorry to tell you this, Miss Grantham, but a body matching your brother's description was found near Carson City 3 days ago. The sheriff there sent word to all nearby settlements. I feared it might be connected to your father's case." The color drained from Sophia's face. Despite suspecting the worst, having it confirmed struck her like a physical blow. Quincy reached for her hand instinctively, providing an anchor as grief threatened to overwhelm her. "He was trying to protect me," she whispered, "to finish what our father started." "And he succeeded," Harrington said gently. "You're here. The evidence is safe, justice will be done." Quincy sat in silence as Harrington outlined the next steps: the secure accommodation he'd arranged for Sophia, the protective detail, the legal proceedings that would follow once federal authorities arrived. Throughout the discussion, he remained acutely aware of Sophia's hand in his, of the warmth and connection that flowed between them despite the circumstances. His part in this story was over. He had delivered her safely as promised. There was nothing keeping him in Helena now, nothing except the woman beside him who had somehow breached the walls he'd built around his heart. As the meeting concluded and Harrington stepped out briefly to arrange an escort to the safe house, Quincy and Sophia found themselves alone for the first time since the confrontation in the hallway. "Thank you," Sophia said quietly, her blue eyes meeting his. "Without you, I would never have made it this far." "You're stronger than you know," Quincy replied. "You would have found a way." "Perhaps," a small smile touched her lips despite her grief. "But I'm glad it was with you." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Quincy had spent years avoiding attachments, convinced that the frontier was no place for such vulnerabilities. Yet in the few days he'd known Sophia Grantham, that certainty had crumbled like sand castles before the tide. "What will you do now?" she asked, the question echoing his own from earlier. "I've got work waiting at the Broken Arrow," he said automatically, then hesitated. The thought of returning to his solitary existence felt hollow suddenly, emptied of purpose. "At least for the winter. And after." Quincy found himself at a crossroads as significant as any trail junction in the wilderness. Ahead lay the familiar path of solitude and self-reliance. Beside it ran another, unexplored, uncertain, but suddenly compelling. Before he could respond, Marshal Harrington returned with news that their escort was ready. The moment for decisions passed, postponed by the practical necessities of ensuring Sophia's continued safety. As they prepared to leave, Harrington took Quincy aside. "I could use a man like you, Zane. Someone who knows the territory and can handle himself in tight spots. These proceedings against Hollister will take months, and Miss Grantham's testimony will be crucial. She'll need protection even after the federal marshals take over the case." The offer surprised Quincy. "I'm no lawman, Marshal." "Neither was I once," Harrington replied with a knowing smile. "Just a soldier who came west looking for something he couldn't name. Think about it." The safe house was a small but well-maintained cabin on the outskirts of Helena, set back from the road and surrounded by pine trees that provided both cover and vantage points. Two deputies would rotate shifts outside, ensuring Sophia's protection until federal authorities arrived. As they settled into this temporary refuge, the emotional and physical toll of their journey finally caught up with them. Sophia moved through the cabin's rooms like a sleepwalker, grief for her brother mingling with relief that their ordeal was nearing its end. Quincy found himself reluctant to leave, inventing reasons to stay a little longer, checking the cabin's defenses, bringing in firewood, ensuring the stove was properly stoked against the autumn chill. Eventually, though, even these tasks were exhausted, and the moment of departure could no longer be delayed. "The deputies know their job," he said awkwardly, standing by the door. "You'll be safe here until the federal marshals arrive." Sophia crossed the room to stand before him, her eyes searching his face. "Will I see you again?" she asked directly, the question stripped away pretenses, demanding honesty. Quincy had spent years moving on, never looking back, never allowing connections to take root. It was how he had survived the frontier's harshness, emotionally if not physically. Yet as he stood there, looking into Sophia's eyes, he recognized that survival was no longer enough. Somewhere during their journey together, his carefully constructed worldview had shifted. The frontier was still dangerous, still unforgiving, but it was also a place where courage and connection could flourish if given the chance. "Yes," he said finally, the single word carrying the weight of a promise. "I need to report back to the Broken Arrow, settle some business there, but I'll return." "Why?" Sophia pressed, needing more than a simple statement of intent. Quincy took a deep breath, venturing into territory far more frightening than any outlaw's ambush. "Because in all my years drifting across this territory, I've never met anyone like you. Because when you trembled when I took your hand that first day, something changed for me too." He reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished. When she didn't, he took her hand in his, that same hand that had trembled at his touch days ago, now steady and certain as it twined with his fingers. "I've spent years believing the frontier is no place for anything beyond survival," he continued. "That attachments are liabilities, that being alone is safer." He shook his head slowly. "But watching you risk everything for justice, for family, it reminded me of things I'd forgotten. That courage isn't just about facing danger alone, sometimes it's about facing it together." Sophia stepped closer, her free hand rising to rest against his chest. "And is that what you want, to face whatever comes next together?" "I don't know what comes next," Quincy admitted. "I just know I want to find out with you beside me." In the quiet cabin, with snowflakes beginning to drift past the windows and the future uncertain but full of possibility, Sophia rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips gently to his. The kiss was brief but profound, a promise, a beginning, a declaration more eloquent than words. When they parted, Quincy saw in her eyes the same wonder he felt, that in this vast, dangerous territory where survival often demanded solitude, they had found in each other something worth the risk of connection. "I'll be here," Sophia said simply, "when you return." 2 weeks, he promised, no longer. As Quincy rode away from Helena that afternoon, the familiar weight of solitude felt different than it had before. No longer a shield against the world's harshness, but a temporary state to be endured until he could return to Sophia's side. The Montana landscape stretched before him, wild and beautiful and dangerous as ever. But for the first time since he'd headed west years ago, Quincy Zane rode with a destination in mind that was more than just the next job or the next town. He rode with purpose, toward a future where survival alone was not enough, where connection was worth the risk, and where the trembling of a hand could be the beginning of a journey neither had expected to take. True to his word, Quincy returned to Helena exactly 14 days later. He arrived with his affairs settled at the Broken Arrow Ranch, his few possessions packed, and Marshal Harrington's offer of employment accepted. The federal investigation into Judge Hollister's corruption had begun in earnest, with Sophia's testimony and her father's evidence at its center. Spring came to Montana territory with the promise of new beginnings. As the snow melted from the valleys and wildflowers began to carpet the foothills, Quincy and Sophia were married in a simple ceremony at Marshal Harrington's home. Her father's journal rested on a table beside them, a witness to the justice they had fought for and a reminder of the courage that had brought them together. They settled on a small parcel of land outside Helena, where the mountains met the prairie. It wasn't the fertile bottomland of Quincy's Missouri childhood, nor the busy streets of Sophia's Denver upbringing, but it was theirs, a place to build something new together. As they stood on the porch of their newly constructed cabin that first summer, watching the sunset paint the distant peaks gold and crimson, Quincy wrapped his arm around his wife's shoulders. "Are you happy here?" he asked, still sometimes wondering if she missed the comforts of city life. Sophia leaned into his embrace, her hand covering his where it rested against her shoulder. "I'm home," she replied simply. "That's more than happiness." Quincy looked out over the land they had claimed together, not just the physical acres, but the future they were building. The frontier remained as challenging and unforgiving as ever, but he no longer faced it alone. In Sophia, he had found not just a partner, but a truth he had spent years denying, that even in the harshest wilderness, the human heart could find connection, purpose, and ultimately peace. And when she trembled at his touch now, it was never from fear or shyness, but from the profound joy of two souls who had found in each other the home they had both been seeking.